with you all.
Great, so let's get started talking about consent. All right, again, this is for grades 7 through 8. There we go. So a general overview that we're going to be talking about today is who we are at the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center, what is consent and why it is important. T and consent, I know many of you may have seen this T video, but we're going to be talking about what is it missing. Let's think more deeply about this T video. We're going to be looking through the age of consent, peer pressures, media pressures, family pressures, and cultural pressures, and then look into resources and wrapping things up. So a little bit about the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center. Now I'll let Lucas talk more about the mending program. But the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center is for anyone, any gender that has been impacted by sexual and gender-based violence. So we do individual and group counseling for youth and adult survivors, as well as their supporters. So we have a lot of parents reaching out to us and partners reaching out to us for support. Our group counseling can be anything from expressive arts to journaling to more psychoeducational, so learning about the brain and trauma. We've had creative responses, storytelling sessions, flow, gentle movement. So a lot of variety of different types of group counseling experiences, as well as our horse program, Building Internal Resilience Through Horses, which is for female identified folks who have experienced any form of trauma between the ages of 12 to 18 to focus on resiliency and emotional regulation. We also have our public education side. We speak to all different ranges of folks between kindergarten, high school, college, university, the Peterborough Petes, various OHL teams, athletic teams, as well as our extended community. And with KSAC, we have a 24-hour texting line, phone line, and web chat as well. So you can contact us in a variety of ways. And maybe Lucas, you could talk about our male allyship program.
Thanks so much, Alicia. So as a part of the public education side of things at KSAC, we have a male ally leadership program called the Mending Program at KSAC, where we engage with young men and men going into emerging adulthood and engaging them to end gender-based violence. And how we do that in our program is we have 4 different 3-hour cohorts. We're going to be having an online program that's kind of self-directed as well, but it'll either be facilitated by myself or other mending facilitators. We talk about gender-based violence, we talk about consent and healthy relationships, we talk about bystander intervention, and then we teach you how to teach this material to the people in your life. We want to make sure that you can take this material and apply it to like your own relationships and lead men in this endeavor to end gender-based violence. Thanks, Alicia.
And what's fantastic too is if you have a group of guys that want to engage in this conversation, Lucas will actually be leading male identified sessions on Fridays. Again, those replays will be available via that website link. Let's get into it. We're also connected to Neech Quinadat Anishinaabe Quawog Service Circle. So they're an Indigenous non-for-profit organization geared toward the development and delivery of healing services for families who have experienced abuse, being abused, or risk at being abused. So it's really about working with the entire family and Indigenous healing practices connected to that. So we have the Healthy Babies, Healthy Children program, housing support, crisis and short-term counseling, youth services, and cultural training. So at the end of the presentation, there is a link to youth groups that are happening with this agency. And we are on the same floor in Peterborough as well. So sorry to go back there, but with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center, our catchment area is Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, Northumberland, and Haliburton. But if you're wanting to learn more about sexual assault centers in your area, you can connect with Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers, and there you can see a variety of the centers across our region and the ones that are in yours. So, what is consent? Consent. Lucas, can you read the definition?
Absolutely.
Very boring definition.
So the boring definition that we have starting off with is consent being the permission for something to happen with the agreement to do something. But that's pretty vague, isn't it, Alicia?
I'd say so.
Yeah. So let's go in and talk about this a little bit more and see about what consent means. right? So when we talk about consent and talk about it in a less boring fashion, consent means respecting people's boundaries and never making assumptions, right? When people tell you what they want and are comfortable with and what they don't want and aren't comfortable with, we need to respect that. That's someone communicating what they want and how they're going to be. Yeah. So like it's always good to clarify and make sure that we respect what people communicate to us. We also, and because consent is never assumed, it's always important to ask first and then listen for an answer. Be receptive for what the person's going to be saying to you. Consent is yes means yes and no means no. And to elaborate on that, ums and silence and otherwise expressions of confusion or just not knowing for sure are opportunities to check in, right? Because consent is never assumed, if we aren't sure about someone, like providing something, because if after we ask a question they respond with absolute silence or sure, right? Those are opportunities for us to check in and clarify and not make those assumptions. And another important part of consent is that we ask everyone all the time. Consent is used in our everyday lives, whether we're with our friends, with our family members, you use it repeatedly, right? Just because you've been in a relationship with someone for a while, you know your friends really well. It's always important to ask.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that, one of the misconceptions is that, well, if you're in a relationship with someone, you don't need to ask every time. And in fact, when it basically comes down to respect, it would just say that you're disrespecting your partner if you aren't asking and checking in every time. Our emotions change day to day. And as we said, consent impacts all areas of our lives. So even doing something like playing sports during recess, right? So this is something that we should always be asking people. Just because you play a game of soccer every day at recess doesn't mean that you want to play soccer every day for every recess, right? So it's so important to check in every time.
Thanks, Lucia.
Now we're going to watch the consent and tea video. Now I know we have shown this to quite a few of you folks, but what I want to do with this activity is to really think about, what does this video miss? What are some things that we hit on for sure, which is, if someone's unconscious, don't give them tea. A clear yes. Not coming and giving them tea every single day, but like, what are some things in this video that we miss? And I apologize, I'm just going to double check to make sure that I've got the sound linked up this time before we launch the video. Hi.
Hey.
Perfect. Here we go.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you can make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware that they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important bit, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you're entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say, "No thank you," then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please, that's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind, and you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they are unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea, and they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea, and they said yes, but in the time it took you to boil the kettle or brew the tea and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down, make sure the unconscious person is safe, and this is the important part again, don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they are safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, "But you wanted tea last week," or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat, going, "But you wanted tea last night." If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you are able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea.
Okay. So this is a video that I'm sure many of you have seen before, and if you haven't, well, surprise. This is one of those very foundational videos to understanding consent, but also with the innuendo of those more intimate connections surrounding consent and sex and consent. And so we're going to go into a couple different things that this video may have missed. But if you're an educator and you're watching the replay, you may want to pause this right now and have this discussion with your class. So what is missing in the tea and consent video? So we're going to highlight three kind of key things here. And of course, you can go into more detail when you're with your class. But so first and foremost, there was an assumption that was made about how this individual wanted their tea. I think in the video it talked about you add the milk and serve the tea. But what if someone wanted cream? Or what kind of sugar or sweetener? Maybe they didn't want anything in their tea. What about allergies? If we're making assumptions about putting milk in someone's tea and they have allergies, then all of a sudden we're causing some pretty bad harm. And now all of a sudden we've got a bigger situation. So this can also be alluded to wearing safer protective measures during intimate connections and sex. So if we are wearing a condom, but we're not asking our partner, whether it's an internal condom or an external condom, about any allergies, there are folks out there that have latex allergies. And finding out that your partner has a latex allergy once you've touched them with that latex condom, that could lead to a much bigger issue. And so it's really important to be a lot more clear when we're asking about what are we doing. So if we're playing a ball game, what kind of ball game are we going to play? Where is it going to happen? If we're going over to a friend's house, it's so much more than just asking your friend if it's okay that you can come to their house, but you have to ask their family. How long are you going to stay? How are you going to get there? And so there's so many different nuances, so many different details that were just missed with how the person wanted their tea in this context. Do you want to go to the next one, Lucas?
Absolutely. Thanks, Alicia. So the second improvement and things that this video has missed out on that we noticed is that how they wanted their tea prepared and served was assumed, right? Did this person want it in a mug? Do they want it in a glass cup? Do they want it hot? Do they want it kind of warmed down? Do they want it cold? Do they want it sweet tea?
Or iced tea.
Or iced tea, right?
Iced tea is awesome.
Yeah.
And I would be so disappointed if someone wanted tea and I thought I was getting iced tea, but then I got regular old tea.
Mm-hmm. Right. So this could be another thing that could be clarified within this, right? Asking the person that you're wanting to have healthy relationships with, like what they can do to kind of prepare that setting, right? Like what's having tea going to look like? What's the vessel that you're going to be having tea in, right?
The environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then asking, maybe some people wanted to put their own milk in or put their own sugar in. And did they want to make it themselves or have it served to them? So these were things that weren't identified. It was just like, here's your tea, off you go. The next one is, did we know if everyone was sober? So sobriety is really important when it comes to consent. If you're engaging in any kind of choice making, or whether it's intimate connections, and you're under the influence of any substance, you are not able to freely give consent because you are under the influence, right? So let's just say this individual was not sober. But what if this not sober individual insisted on having tea? If they were under the influence and go, no, 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 I really want tea. No, give me all the tea. I want all the tea. That could be something like a much bigger discussion to have, right? And so, or what if this this person who's intoxicated is forcing you to drink tea? So it creates a much more bigger discussion around why we need a sober and clear yes in order to engage in really any connection that we're having. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But those are just the things that popped into our minds. So what is consent? Now, this video really breaks down, as Lucas and I break down, different types of concepts within consent. So we know that consent is so much more than a yes or a no. And as we saw within the consent and tea video, there's a mix of facial expressions, right? So how the person said no is that they shook their head. So that's a facial expression that we need to pay attention to. How someone was saying yes, and that it wasn't just, yeah, sure, but that it was actually very loud and enthusiastic, but also their body language, right? Where their arms crossed, where they turned away. So keeping these three things in mind kind of builds on our understanding of consent. So let's go and watch this clip. When we're talking about consent, yes, it happens in everyday life, but something that we have to remember is that, of course, it happens in our intimate life as well. And we're going to be going over 4 key components, but with those 4 key components, keep in mind that we have to look out for verbal signals, body language, and facial expressions as well. So let's see what those 4 key concepts are.
Awesome. So the 4 principles that we talk about when we talk about consent are freely given, mutually agreed upon, enthusiastic and clear, and repeated and reversed. So let's go into detail with these principles one by one.
So freely given is that we are able to freely decide and say what it is that we want or don't want to do. In the definition here, it says consent is never coerced. So we're never threatening people, and you never have to feel threatened to have a response, to say what you want to say. And it's always between sober folks. Of course, this is a legal definition, but keep in mind, when we're engaging in intimate practices and we're impaired, maybe we feel pressure to do something, it ultimately restricts our options and increases the chances of harm occurring. So you think about signing up for a bank account. They're not going to allow you to sign up for a bank account while you're impaired, or to drive a car. So why? Because your thinking is impaired. Your ability to make rational decisions, or maybe ethical decisions, is impaired when you're not sober, when you're under the influence of a substance. So when substances are involved, there is an increase of harm that's happening. And it's kind of illegal. Things to keep in mind.
And the second principle is that it's mutually agreed upon. So this principle about consent really emphasizes that consent is an interactive process, right? It's something that not one party or one person is going to be making all the decisions for. Every single person and all parties need to be willing and wanting for this thing to happen, right? And a part of that piece is that they're informed about what's happening, right? So this is going to be talking about what we want before we do it, right? And really emphasizing that, like, this is something that everybody wants and not just one person wants.
And when we're talking to people and hearing about what they want, we have to make sure that it is enthusiastic and clear. It's active, it's obvious. And so hearing things like "this feels good" or "keep going" are really great indicators. But sometimes we hear things like "sure" and "uh-huh." How do we know if that "sure" is a yes sure versus that "sure" being a no sure? Well, obviously keeping in mind our verbal cues, facial expressions, and body language, but the best thing that you can do is ask. Do you like that? How does this feel? Are you enjoying this? They are all great ways to check in.
And our last principle is that consent is repeated and reversed. So this really emphasizes that consent is an ongoing and continuous process, right? It's not just about an initial yes and a yes to every other action thenceforth, right? You're going to be open to yeses and nos changing, right? A yes can initially become a no, or a let's try something else, or a maybe later, right? So a key part about consent is that you're ready and open to what we were talking about before, those facial, verbal, and body language cues to indicate those ongoing continuous yeses. And something to keep in mind is that you can always stop, right? Just because you said yes before does not mean that you have to go, you have to keep going, right? It's a continuous process. You can say no, you can change your mind. Yeah.
Awesome. So again, consent is freely given.
Mutually agreed upon.
It's enthusiastic and clear.
And repeated and reversed.
Great. Okay. So a lot of key concepts here, and some things that we just want to quickly unpack is that when someone is unable to consent, so there's a variety of different ways here that Lucas is going to go through.
Thanks so much, Alicia. So just to emphasize, taking from that video that we showed before, there are instances where you're not able to provide this fully freely given, uncoerced, mutually agreed upon like consent that we were talking about. And those instances are when you're intoxicated, right? When we're intoxicated with some sort of substance, or even if like we're too tired, like that could be like a form of that, right? Our decision-making processes are impaired. We're not going to be able to be open to interpret those ongoing yeses that were talked about, right? We're not going to be fully aware and prepared to listen to people, right? And that's a very key concept and like crucial thing that we need if we're going to be having healthy relationships. We need to be open to those facial, verbal, and body language cues. And someone who is not conscious, barely conscious, passed out or asleep are instances where they are not able to consent, right? You can't talk to someone who's asleep. And you can't know if someone's wanting someone, if they're something when they're asleep, right? They can't talk to you. And we need that verbal confirmation. Someone is unable to consent if they're underage, right? And I think we're going to be going into the age of consent later on, and I think we'll unpack that a little bit more there. But essentially, like, we want to make sure that consent is operating on equal grounds, right? So we don't want to have people's answers and yeses being coerced. And when someone is underage, that coerced element is present. Right? We want to make sure that people are safe engaging in these relationships, and that's why we have the age of consent. Moving on, someone is unable to consent if they don't know what is being consented to, right? That's why we have that informed piece. You have to know what you're agreeing to in order to fully consent to it, right? I think like Alicia has a really good example with like sports, right? Like if say your friends are asking like, hey, do you want to go play like a sport outside of recess? And you're like, oh boy, yeah, I love soccer. I would love to play soccer with you. And then you go outside to play with your friend and it ends up being football. You're like, what? This isn't what I agreed to, right? So we weren't fully informed in that case and weren't able to provide a like fully informed consent, right?
Yeah, and we've talked about the threat and pressure to make those decisions or being coerced. So saying, if you don't do this, then this. So those are just, you're unable to consent essentially if you're experiencing that. And so age of consent in Canada, really briefly here. So the age of consent, people under the age of 12 are unable to consent to any sort of, now this is going into more sexual activity, the focus here. So if you're under the age of 12, you cannot consent. For 12 and 13-year-olds, that is within a 2-year or older age difference. So a 12-year-old would not be able to consent with a 14-year-old because that's greater than 2 years. So it has to be less than 2 years of age. 14 or 15 is less than 5. So yeah, that means that a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old are able to engage in intimate connections. But when we think about what is a 14-year-old doing versus what is an 18-year-old doing, there seems that there may be some unequal power in that relationship, right? So it's really important that we think about those not only legal definitions of consent, but also the social definitions, right? And what kind of other things could be going on. And these can be bigger conversations that you could have with your class as well. And so the age of consent in Canada is 16 years of age or older, but there are exceptions, and some of the exceptions we see here listed on the side. So the other person has a relationship or trust or authority over them, or you're dependent on that person. So that could be a family member, a coach, a teacher, a religious leader, a babysitter. So that's a position of power or authority. It involves exploitative activities such as prostitution, trafficking, or creating pornographic content. They are paid or offer payment. You cannot consent to that if you're under the age of 16, or sorry, if you are 16. And if you are engaging in anal sex, so unless you're legally married, which in Canada you can be legally married at the age of 16, but you cannot engage in that sort of practice. So it's just a lot of different exceptions to keep in mind here. So there's a lot of external pressures that we can feel to engage in certain types of, whether it be intimate activity or just certain activities in general. So we can feel pressure from our peers, right? If everyone else is doing it, maybe you should be doing it too. And like I always go back to that, playing sports at recess, right? If you see everyone else playing a sport, if you see everyone else lining up to go inside, even though the bell hasn't rung yet, you could feel that pressure to want to do it because your friends are doing it, right? Aren't we friends? Like, don't you want to do this with me? That could be a big pressure. With our family, so whether we're like having to hug our family, Thanksgiving weekend just happened, right? So thinking about, we may feel obligated to hug our family because they're family, right? But that may not make us comfortable. So these are much bigger conversations as well. If our family is the one causing harm, right? This could create a really difficult situation to navigate. Or maybe you've had harm happen in your life and you've told your family members, but they didn't believe you. So there could be pressure to not think it's a big deal, right? So these are much bigger conversations, as I've said. Online spaces and media, so dealing with trolls and really horrific comments. Or maybe we've met a really nice person online and they're expecting us to now send sexual messages, pictures, and videos. And so how do we navigate consent with that? And even within our culture or our social structures, there could be certain gender roles, especially as men that Lucas can speak to, that men are supposed to be these strong, athletic types of risk-taking individuals. And so that could be really difficult if all your friends are, let's say, jumping off a bridge, which you're not supposed to be doing, but you see everyone doing it, and people may be looking at you and like, well, why aren't you doing it, right? So that could be a pressure. And even in intimate dating realms as well, we see every Disney movie has they get married and then happily ever after. But what if you don't get married? What if you're not in a relationship? So there could be a pressure to engage in these types of relationships and activities that is kind of hard to navigate. And so again, these are much bigger questions that I implore you to have with your cohort, your classmates, friends, etc. But what we ultimately want you to know is that your experience is valid. You are certainly not alone if you've had these types of pressures or experiences, and we are certainly here to support you, and you are worthy of that support because you are an important person. And so there are a variety of different supports that if you need someone to reach out to, there's people that you can. So whether it's someone at your school, like a teacher, a principal, or a guidance counselor, maybe looking over to a medical profession, right, and getting advice from them, or even Indigenous services and supports if you need, as well as at KSAC with our 24/7 crisis support lines, which we'll go over in a little bit. But if you've experienced any form of sexual or gender-based violence, Survivor Toolkit is a really great website that kind of takes you through different supports and what that looks like. If you're part of the 2S LGBTQ+ community, there's a 24-hour line there, as well as Kids Help Phone and PFLAG Canada, which is for parents of queer children and youth. And if you're having questions about dating and relationships, there's a website called Scarlet Teen. This is written by youth for youth. And so if you're having questions about your body, if you're having questions about your relationships, whether that's your relationship with yourself or your relationships with other people, that is a really good tool and resource that you can get some information from. So to wrap things up, Lucas, you can go ahead with this one.
Thanks so much, Alicia. So we learned a lot today, and something that we want you to make sure that you take from this is that we learned that consent is an everyday thing that we do with everyone. This is something that we do like in our intimate relationships and also in our everyday friendships, relationships with family, relationships with teachers, right? We always want to make sure that we're applying consent everywhere. And we also learned that consent is more than a yes or no, right? We learned that consent is facial expressions, body language, and also verbal communication, right? And that it has these elements of being freely given, mutually agreed upon, active and enthusiastic, and that is continuous and ongoing, right? It's a lot more than a yes and no. And that, oh yeah, and those principles that really like build that like much more useful definition of consent are freely given, mutually agreed upon, enthusiastic and clear, and repeated and reversed. We also learned that we must respect people's answers to not engage or engage in activity, right? And that's what respecting someone looks like, and that's what respecting someone's boundaries are, right? We wouldn't want to make people feel uncomfortable. We want to make sure that people are operating in the spaces that they feel best with.
Especially as leaders, as grade 7 and 8, a lot of you are the top grade in your school, right? So a lot of people are looking up to you for role modeling behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important that we are respecting people and their answers that they are giving as the basis of consent.
Thanks so much, Alicia. And the last thing that we learned is that sometimes we may feel pressure to say yes, but know that like you can always say no, and that your answer is 100% valid, and that it's not your fault if someone doesn't respect your answer that you gave, right? Or if they didn't check in or listen, that's on them. Consent is a mutually thing. It's a mutually agreed upon thing. It's an interactive experience. It's not going to be determined by one person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so if you are a teacher, we would really appreciate if you do fill out the survey that was attached in the write-up with all the webinar scheduling. And so again, if you are looking for those supports with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center, we have 3 different 24/7 crisis support lines. So we have our text line there. Again, these are all available 24/7, our phone line. And if you can't remember those numbers, no problem. You can head on over to our website, kawarthasexualassaultcenter.com. There you can get connected to all of our social media accounts, as well as our services that we offer. With Neech Quinadat, Anishinaabe Quawag Service Circle, they do have youth groups. So if you do have an Indigenous background, they do have youth groups that are available for you. These are happening in virtual spaces with a variety of different activities that are going on, traditional medicine, self-care, the grandfather teachings, and these are going to be happening every Monday from 4 to 6 p.m. So we really want to thank you all for tuning in today and talking about consent. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care.